I do think that it's the most easiest thing to get started with. However, for starters, I'm only going to talk about a couple of subjects, not to overwhelm you. So for this reason, I chose a quite easy topic, namely the art section, because this is the closest thing to my heart first, and secondly, and I think that this is the most easiest thing to start with. So the first topic will be static or animated. The reason why I choose this topic is because you have to make sure that if you make a static object, you try to optimize it as much as possible. And if you want to make an animated object, like an NPC, you try to optimize it as much as possible for animations. And this is the reason why I brought this topology example up, because as you can see with the red lines, that if you do not try to maintain your mesh flow, and if you want to subdivide your object later on, you will run into errors. So thus you always have to make sure that you have a clean, or at least as clean as you can get, topology, that is. So for the second subject, I try to find a very serious subject, such as this quality or quantity matter, because from time to time I realized that some people have some good game ideas out there, and they try to make everything they figured out or they imagined, and they do not have time for it. So this is a good example that you always have to make sure that whether you have time for it or whether you want to get the job done. So that's how we try to approach this matter perspectives. The first one would be whether you have time for this, or whether you have a schedule which you have to follow, or a deadline. So the next topic is about whether your object is visible to player or not. Basically under this I mean that whether you have to model every small detail your object has or not. This is very crucial, because if you spare the time not to model everything in, you not just make your life much more easier, you also spare precious computing resources such as CPU or memory. And after this I'm going to talk about the high or low triangle limit. So basically one side is about that whether you want to aim to high-end PC users, for example, or not, and the second perspective would be that how many draw calls do you want to have per screen. What this means that whether you want to place dozens of objects in your scene, in your world, or whether you want to just put 3 or 4 visible things within your game or whatever you're working on, and thus you can play with the performance quite a lot. Oh, and I almost forgot the third perspective. So whether you have time to model everything, every detail, so whether you have to use methods such as normal mapping to project your details onto your low poly or not. And as usual, whether you have a high or low triangle limit determines how much time or how much effort you have to put into your models. And for the last subject, it would be that whether you have a reference image or not. I think this speaks for itself, but basically I mean that whether you have an image or some kind of drawing to follow in order to produce an object or not. Because if you're not a professional and you do not know anatomy at all, it is a good guideline to follow, for example, that is. So first I thought I would bring up a nice example, such as this power supply, and as you can see, if you want to, then you can create the final end result with only using 2 triangles. And this is a quite extreme example I'm showing you, but I hope you will get the idea that if you have a static object, you can optimize it extremely low if you want to and if you have to, but in the animated section, or if you have an animated object, you cannot do this because the end result will be awful. So this is the reason why I'm showing you this simple object. So as you can see, I cannot bend it, and nobody can bend it because it has no intersections. You are only allowed to turn it or flip it. In order to do this, you have to add intersections, and as you insert loops, you will find out that the more details you're adding animating into a specific place. For example, if this would be a finger, then you will be able to bend it much more smoother, and in the end the animation would look much more realistic. So this is the reason why I mentioned that you have to optimize your mesh deformation for animating, and not to forget that if you have a static object, and if you have to, then you should optimize your triangles according to that. And there's a huge thing between the static or animated objects, because even though you start with the same workflow, in the end you do not animate and rig your static object in general. By this, the amount of time you spend on a static object is multiplied by 4 or 5 times when you have to work on an animated one. So thus, it does matter whether you want to make static or an animated object. And finally, as usual, you have to finalize your objects for your engine or your game you're working with, because even though you think you have your finished project within your 3D editor or whatever software you're using, you have to make sure that it looks the same in the engine, because sometimes they look different because the game or the engine uses different kind of shaders, or you have some errors which you forgot to clean up. So I hope you enjoyed this small video, and once more, don't forget to rate, comment and subscribe.